Hello and welcome to the Sonic Cinema Podcast. My name is Brian Scuttle. Thank you for joining me at www.sonic-cinema.com, as well as the Sonic Cinema Podcast YouTube channel. You can also check us out on Google, Apple, and Spotify for podcasts. And we also have patreon.com/Sonic Cinema. There you will find early access to some newer reviews, some older movies I'm seeing for the first time reviewed. And this month, for exclusively for patrons, I'm going through the DCEU in preparation for Zack Snyder's Justice League to come out. And I'm doing some new brief video reviews for that. And so that is www.patreon.com/Sonic Cinema. Last year marked the 10th anniversary since we lost one of the great anime filmmakers, although I would say probably one of the great filmmakers of our time, in Satoshi Kon. If you are not necessarily familiar with his work, he did Perfect Blue, Millennium Actress, Tokyo Godfathers, and Paprika among his feature credits, as well as a TV series called Paranoia Agent. Joining me to discuss Satoshi Kon and his work is a friend of mine whom you've heard several times on the podcast before. We discussed Princess Mononoke for the Class of 1999 series, and I'm pleased to join the podcast again, Mr. David Miles. Thank you very much for joining me.
Glad to be here.
What was your first? Do you remember when your first experience with Satoshi Kon's work was?
Yeah, I think it was Paranoia Agent, actually. I think I had missed. Well, no, it may have been. Shoot. I think it was actually maybe Millennium Actress because but it's just kind of fuzzy because I was into at the time I was into this is back in the early 2000s I was much more into TV series and so maybe Millennium Actress, maybe Paranoia Agent, but I know I remember seeing Tokyo Godfathers with you.
Yeah.
Back in the day, and so I'm not sure if we saw that like right when it came out or later, but I think I kind of got into Satoshi Kon kind of like all around that early 2000 times, and so I would say I can't quite remember right now, but it's either Millennium Actress or Paranoia Agent that I first got into his work.
Okay, yeah, and yeah. I remember when we went to go see Tokyo Godfathers together down in Atlanta, and I can't remember if we saw Paprika together. Because I know I saw that theatrically, but I can't remember if you and I ended up seeing that together or not.
Yeah, I don't think we did. I don't think we did.
But I had already watched. By the time Tokyo Godfathers came up, I had already seen Perfect Blue and Millennium Actress. I caught up with both of those, and one of the things that I'm always so struck by whenever I watch his work, and especially watching all of those films for the first time, is this is it's like it's funny when you think of anime. I think a lot of people who may not necessarily be familiar with the medium always kind of think of it as having similar styles. But if you look at the films of Satoshi Kon compared to, say, Hayao Miyazaki, you can definitely tell different styles, very distinct styles of animation. Even though it's essentially hand-drawn, essentially traditional cell animation. And that even includes something like Ghost in the Shell or Akira as well.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's kind of easy to lump. It's kind of easy to lump animation all in one thing anyway. And then, if you are familiar with Western animation, but you're not necessarily familiar with anime, it's easy to lump that in together. But once you really get into it, yeah, I mean, there are definitely distinct art styles, and then and once you understand like that there are distinct art styles, then you start actually getting into the distinct studios, that do the art, and so then you start. And I know within the anime community, it's like there's certain people that like certain. If they hear of a new anime coming out and they hear it's from a certain studio, they might be into it or not into it just because of the studio that's doing the art, right? Regardless of who maybe necessarily the director is. So yeah, and for me, I think maybe Princess Mononoke, but definitely once I started watching Millennium Actress and Perfect Blue. What struck me about those is just how, being such a fan of Western animation and growing up with, say, He-Man, and all that, just how adult this animation was, right?
Yeah.
And this is even after watching some anime. I'm gonna throw out some names like Noir and stuff like that. Which are kind of adult anime, or Witch Hunter Robin, or Cowboy Bebop, which are adult, but sort of. But it all kind of came like in the early 2000s, just like how adult this stuff was, and then you have Satoshi Kon coming in with not just sort of an adult themes, but really taking it to the next level with imagery, really taking it to the next level with scenarios, and it being hard to. I mean, for some of the stuff, hard to follow in terms of story, or really having to focus, in terms of story as to like where things are going. Because Perfect Blue, definitely when I watched that the first time, it threw me for a loop, and I thought, particularly. During the scene, there's towards the end of the movie where there's like she's getting like some sort of an interview from like a mental health professional or therapist, and I thought we were there. I thought that was the end of the movie, but then it kept going after that, So it's just the level of maturity of his movies in particular, but then of anime at that time period, what really struck me.
Yeah, and. I mean, it's something that really is missing from Western animation, in particular American animation, because Disney and Warner Brothers and Looney Tunes and all of that, they've so cornered the market on animation as a family medium that nobody's really ever been able to bring a more mature a more mature sensibility to it. I mean, there are occasionally attempts, and I know Richard Linklater did some animation in the 2000s with Waking Life and A Scanner Darkly, where he tried to bring a more mature type of animated film from American filmmakers. But even that, I mean, even that with him, it's essentially rotoscoping live action. I mean, I guess really the only filmmaker that I can think of in terms of American filmmakers that has really been somewhat successful as far as more mature animation is, and even success by his standards is questionable whether you can call it that, is Ralph Bakshi, where, I mean, you've got stuff like Fritz the Cat and American Pop and his Lord of the Rings adaptation from the late 70s, and those are definitely not of the same school as Disney or Don Bluth or Warner Brothers, but at the same time, it's like they also don't go quite to the same places that Satoshi Kon or some of the other anime filmmakers do.
Right. When I think about adult animation and in the West, one of the interesting things is like I think there are certain, and this is more around like TV series, but I think there are certain animators that sneak it in, right? Mm-hmm. Right. Where it'll be a children's show, but the themes are more not necessarily for adults, but more for teenagers, and so there's an appeal to adults, particularly the adults that grew up with the shows. So like a Batman the animated series, or a Justice League animated series, or even something like Avatar: The Last Airbender. It's just what's so interesting about these shows is that they start off as little kids shows and they kind of grow with the audience. And so if you watch, for example, Avatar: The Last Airbender season 1, it's distinctly different in terms of themes and voice acting and stuff like that versus season 3, right? And there's definitely an evolution. And then the sequel sort of series to Avatar: The Last Airbender was Legend of Korra. And Avatar: The Last Airbender featured like kids that grew into teenagers, and Legend of Korra starts off with a teenager. Right. What I've often see on the Western side is like these TV shows that kind of sneak in as kids shows, but are more like young adult teenager shows by the time they finish up. That's where I think kind of where the sweet spot of animation for adults is in the West. I mean, sometimes you see like even like a Frozen, will have things that appeal to adults because they know that adults are going to be sitting in the theater right next to the kids. Right. So they'll have elements that appeal to adults. But I would say that's even a step back in the evolutionary chain from a TV show like a Batman the Animated Series, which evolves into from kids to teenagers, but then that's a step back from a Satoshi Kon or maybe a Miyazaki, that is just feels like it's for adults, and for Miyazaki, one of the interesting things about him is that I had stayed away from his movies for a long time, then kind of got back into it, and we had talked about this with Princess Mononoke, but I didn't realize how violent that movie was. Yeah. And in my mind, I had this was, Miyazaki is a softer Satoshi Kon. So, he'd be okay for kids to watch. And then I rewatched Princess Mononoke. I was like, oh my gosh, like people's heads are getting chopped off and whatnot, I'm not entirely sure. Because the West is definitely taking now more influences from anime, and manga is so huge and it's just completely eclipsed comics books, right? And I know there's been a couple of manga stories that have been optioned by various studios. So I'm wondering if we'll see some sort of we may not have a Satoshi Kon, but we'll see some adult animation coming back into play at a Miyazaki, Satoshi Kon, Japanese anime level in the West at some point.
Yeah, and I'm curious because of the fact that with all of the studios essentially developing their own projects for streaming now, it's like we've talked about the move towards streaming just individually, and I can certainly see. I can certainly see studios taking more of some studios, not necessarily like Disney or what have you. Although if they really wanted to expand their horizons, especially when it comes to when I know they've already done it overseas, but when they eventually bring their more PG-13 up projects to Disney Plus, or whether they do that versus on Hulu in the States or what have you, at least some of these other studios like Warner Brothers with HBO Max or Paramount Plus or Netflix even. I mean, Netflix might be the one that is more likely to do it, I would imagine, than any of them because of the fact that with some of the animation projects they've done, they've definitely skewed more towards not as much family friendly, although I mean there's still a lot of that, but also not being afraid of more mature themes and more mature ideas, to where maybe they do give a blank check to an anime filmmaker and say, do what you want.
Yeah. I would say definitely that Netflix is probably at the forefront of that, and if we're going to see some sort of a renaissance there in terms of Western animators, directors, animation directors, whatnot, taking taking influences perhaps from anime and starting to make really adult movies / TV shows that are animated. It's probably going to be on Netflix. Like, I mean, they're kind of already doing it. They're making their own anime and things like that. But that's probably going to be where it happens first, at least.
Mm-hmm. So let's bring this back to Satoshi Kon and his first feature, which was Perfect Blue. And I know the thing that struck me. I know it was hard for. Like, you couldn't really. There were some places, like video stores, that didn't really rent anime. I mean, unless it was a bigger title like Ghost in the Shell or even Akira, but even that could be hard to find at times. So there were a few movies in those early days, as far as anime, that I essentially blind bought because of the fact that I was curious to see them. And one of them was Perfect Blue. And I know the reason Perfect Blue stood out is because they had a quote from, I believe a quote from James Cameron. And he basically he likened this to Hitchcock. He likened this to sort of that type of vein of thriller. And that really intrigued me because of the fact that I was still relatively new to watching anime, but I think I was also just coming off of Princess Mononoke, and I had seen Akira by this point, so I was the hook was definitely in me to get to see more anime, and this for me, this is still one of the best movies I've ever seen. It just continues to engage me every single time, and one of the things that you'll find when we are talking about Satoshi Kon on this episode is that he really had a gift for playing with the reality of his characters. And the one exception to that is Tokyo Godfathers, which is more of a straightforward narrative. But even something like Millennium Actress, which feels like it should be a relatively straightforward narrative, plays with reality in a way that, it reminds me of, Millennium Actress reminds me of Sunset Boulevard, the Billy Wilder film, where that film is about a silent age star who essentially is at the end of her stardom, and she's basically living alone, and she has this desire to still be a star. And so Millennium Actors sort of feels in that vein, although not quite as dark as Sunset Boulevard was. Perfect Blue is essentially Hitchcock. It's essentially Vertigo. It's essentially Marnie. It's even Rebecca, his 1940 Oscar winner. And the thing this is about a pop star who is trying to transition to an acting career. And she's leaving the thing that made her famous and made her popular, and she's trying to branch out into something else. And there's basically a stalker that is terrorizing her and sending her notes and basically threatening her to go back to being a pop star. And the way that the descent into for Mimi, the main character, into madness, this film was very much an inspiration for if you've seen it, but you haven't seen Perfect Blue. Darren Aronofsky's Black Swan with Natalie Portman is very much in this vein of film. And it's interesting. I was thinking about this in regards to, recently we got a documentary on about Britney Spears and the way she was handled by the press, the way she was governed by the press in her at the height of her fame, and how the press basically the press essentially drove her crazy. And it's weird to, and it's funny to see. It's not funny, but it's interesting to see parallels in some of these real life scenarios to what we see in for Mima, the main character in Perfect Blue.
Yeah. I think he has, so Satoshi Kon has this gift to, in his stories, in his movies, kind of compare, sort of the different personas that a person might live between public, private, on screen, off screen, and so. And it's interesting. Not only how well he kind of captured sort of the lifestyle or the pressures that's put onto a Japanese idol singer, but then so number one, just how well he captured that. But then number two, just how interestingly he told the story of like how their maybe public and private lives blended together, or how the public and private lives weren't respected, there's a sequence where the idol group that she left, they start becoming successful, and so this idea of like, okay, I'm leaving something to do something else, but then when I look back, maybe people have continued on without me. And so maybe I regret that a little bit, or I see them, becoming successful, when I look back. Maybe you can even compare this to like leaving a job or something like that, and you see the company continue to be successful without you, do you kind of almost have like a regret and kind of want to go back and kind of capture that concept there. And so he just, he captured all these aspects of, of a person going through a transition like that so well. That was really amazing. And I'm sure when you look at it, when you look at potentially like the life of Britney Spears or like a Justin Bieber, or something like that through the lens of this movie, you can understand what they would all basically go insane. I actually remember Justin Bieber when he first came onto the scene when he was like just a little kid, basically, and how his parents were talking about how he'll always be, okay, because he's got this good head on his shoulders and stuff like that. And we have him now where, he's kind of gone a little off the reservation, and he had sort of what his parents didn't want, which was sort of the typical, little pop star, little kid kind of going into, a very difficult adolescence and a difficult adulthood and not really knowing themselves. He kind of had that. And so, the ability for him to capture that, I thought was very, very well done. And again, viewing the lives of these famous people through that lens of Perfect Blue, it's like, yeah, I mean, I can understand better, which is weird, but I can understand better the lives of a Britney Spears or a Justin Bieber because I've seen, this movie.
Yeah. And one of the most remarkable things to think about is that this movie initially came out in 1997. And the internet was still very new when it came to fan culture, when it came to, message boards, when it came to online interactions with fans and stuff like that. It's certainly not nearly the levels of that it is now, where you can essentially tweet somebody or comment on their Instagram and what have you, and maybe even get a response. But it's one of the things that's really kind of remarkable in this film is that you have Mima's room, which is the message board that the stalker essentially runs, and is one of the things that really starts to torment Mima. And you see the potential for psychological torture that a star can feel and the pressures that Star can feel, or even somebody on the rise to stardom can feel when it comes to fan interactions in something like that. And this is like almost 25 years ago. And right now you look at it is that, you know, Hollywood, I think it was either Hollywood Reporter or Variety had an article about Kelly Marie Tran with Ryan the Last Dragon coming out this week, and one of the things that, and you really do kind of see some of the toll that experience took on her, emotionally speaking, being put under the microscope, and then the way that she just essentially had to completely divest herself from it in order to heal. And that's one of the things that is really, you know, it's something that I think I think social media has kind of turbocharged the potential for that, but and it's something that we're essentially still reckoning with, and I think we'll probably always reckon with when it comes to social media and the internet in general.
Yeah. It's interesting how you know, he was able to kind of see these things, you know, in the telling of this story, kind of see these things and almost prophesize about like how bad they would eventually turn out to be, you know, unchecked. And you know, I think some of the just in terms of celebrities, and you know, how they kind of go through this sort of thing. Some of the best ones, you know, what they do is they don't have a social media, right? And they really are able to set decent boundaries between, you know, private and public, right? Mm-hmm. And so that always makes Satoshi Kon's you know, thing so interesting, is that, you know, the melding of private and public, you know, the melding of the personas, because you have to think that even people that do well to separate the two have moments, you know, where they combine. And if you even have too many of those moments, just in your own head, you know, mm-hmm. you actually end up, you know, at a bad place. And so, yeah, no, it's you know, it's interesting to see how you know, he almost forecasted kind of where we would be with some of these things. You know, I do think, you know, just as sort of a social commentary thing, that things will get better. I think you know, the concept of social media amplifying things, and the idea that children or young people are being you know, sort of mentally hurt, you know, like that's going to come back to bite some of these companies, and you know, and there's going to be some regulation that gets put into place. You know, Facebook's mm-hmm. Google's already in trouble, right? So you know, the Justice Department is already going after both those companies, and so I'm actually hopeful that we went to where Satoshi Kon kind of forecasted. Mm-hmm. We went there, right? But I'm actually hopeful that we're not going to stay there, because we will actually figure out how to balance this thing. But we definitely went to where Satoshi Kon kind of forecasted. We definitely went there.
Oh yeah, definitely. And the you know, it once things shatter for Mima in this movie, as far as once the idea of her reality kind of shatters, it's like, up until that point, it's a really interesting thriller. It's very much in the vein of Hitchcock. It's very much in the vein of a filmmaker playing with the ideas that Hitchcock played with and doing it very successfully. But once the reality is shattered for Mima, it's like, I feel like that's kind of where Satoshi Kon's gifts as a storyteller, just in general, snap into focus, because of the fact that, to a certain extent, he's kind of he kind of gives himself permission to go off the leash there. And right. I think when he's really dealing with a not a consistent sense of reality, I think is some of his strongest. It's also some of his most uh, it's also some of the storytelling that you almost have to take a leap of faith with in a way. And I mean, I feel like you kind of see that especially with films like Paprika and TV shows like Paranoia Agent too.
Right. Yeah. I was watching a couple documentaries, and I saw him make this comparison between almost sort of like the dual personas that he has in his movies, or the multiple personas. He says that there's a hoodlum Khan and a mature Khan, right?
Yeah.
And within within sort of the mature Khan, the sort of the businessman, the one that he knows is making a movie, he can let the hoodlum Khan kind of run wild, right?
Yeah.
And so that's what you see, say, at the beginning of Paprika, where there's just these insane cuts that are just magnificent, but they're insane, where the movie begins to, in his movies things begin to like just fall apart and just be crazy and fast and beautiful. That's where he's just really, really going off the reservation, but that's when he's doing some of his best work, because this just, he's saying a whole bunch of things visually, a lot of times, but it's very fast, but it's at the same time it's well communicated, or that you're in like the depths of a character's psyche, and you've been dragged into this area of understanding that's just deep, or you're sitting on sort of the razor edge between both of their lives, and you're looking at both of them at the same time, so yeah, I mean that's where you really get. I mean, his storytelling is great all the time, but that's where you really get to the meat of his talent and abilities.
Yeah, and it's interesting because of the fact that it's like it's sometimes it's difficult to really sort of understand, especially with animation, given how much control the filmmaker, the director, has on sort of camera angles, for lack of a better term, or essentially the way a shot is composed. And there's a bit more freedom with that in animation, and also a bit more control with that in terms of animation. And I think something like Perfect Blue and Millennium Actress is a great way to sort of show the show that you can make a film, an animated film that is essentially in a genre that you're familiar with, in a type of story that you're familiar with. And Tokyo Godfathers does this as well, and it's arguably the most conventional film that Satoshi Kon made. And it's like, but at the same time, you don't necessarily, you still see the animation in it, you still see the artistic part of the animation, but you also are thinking of it in traditional cinematic terms as well.
Right. Yeah, it's almost like his movies are kind of a showcase for doing your almost traditional film themes, whatever, but in animation, like showcasing it that it can be done, and it can be done, but in a way that takes advantage of what you can do with animation, which might be possible or ridiculously expensive with live action.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons his next film, Millennium Actress, it's like you and I have had this discussion in the past where it's like it's one of those things where it's like I very much recognize that Perfect Blue, I have an increased affection for Perfect Blue, but I can also, there are also times rewatching it that something like Millennium Actress really grabs me, and I'm almost preferential to that, like immediately after watching it, because it's just such a beautiful and creative way of telling that particular story.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's I'm kind of the same way. I mean, I definitely have favorites, in terms of maybe even just scenes, and especially music from his various movies and whatnot. But I mean, I'd be hard pressed to say like Millennium Actress isn't his might be his best film.
Yeah.
I mean, it's certainly is I think may not be my favorite of his films, but I mean, I think it's just one of his best films. Period. His best pieces of work. Period. I mean, it's just it's a really it's really amazing, and it's you can almost see almost kind of like we were talking about before, where you could tell you would tell a live action story in that way, sort of a flashbacky type thing, but it's more than that. It's doing it in a way that takes advantage of animation, and there's much more of a meld. Present past, that you just don't see being done in sort of a Western live action animation. It's taking that traditional storytelling of here's a flashback of my life and taking it to the next level.
Yeah, and when I was writing notes for each of these movies, when I was watching them with Millennium Actors, one of the things they said was it's almost like an animated documentary, where it's essentially about these filmmakers who are discussing the history of an old studio with one of the studio's great legends as an actress. And
right. Yeah.
I love the fact that the animation medium allows Satoshi Kon to take the filmmakers into the past and make it come alive in a way that a traditional documentary really would not allow that.
Right. Agreed. Yeah, it's just it's kind of like what you just said. I mean, he's able to just to add layers on top of what you would typically expect, and in a gripping way. It's just and I know he was very much a collaborator, and so he's definitely collaborating quite a bit in his animations, but the storytelling is distinctly him.
Yeah. And it's very much an evolution style from Perfect Blue, and the way it embraces a lack of reality that really you can only achieve through animation, and it's hard to do in live action. I mean, it would be very prohibitive to do a movie like this in live action, just from a financial standpoint. And it's funny because of the fact that like this is the story of Millennium Actors was inspired by two Japanese actresses, and that character's story was inspired by that. But I also love that, as somebody who loves old films, who started to really get into world cinema and really embrace world cinema, you have references to Godzilla, the original Godzilla in this. You have references to Kurosawa in this, and one of his movies, Throne of Blood. And that's something I wouldn't have gotten until I saw Throne of Blood myself. But I mean, the Godzilla references, it's like most people know essentially what Godzilla looks like. So I mean, it's pretty easy to pick out that reference. But having that type, I mean, yes, you could easily just throw footage into that in a live action documentary, but to craft animated homages to these two titans of world cinema in Godzilla and Kurosawa is just it's going to another level to celebrate cinema. And that's one of the things that is just so wonderful about this film, and just really his work in general, because when we talk about Tokyo Godfathers, it's very much a traditional Hollywood. It's essentially a very traditional Hollywood story, and it's a story that Hollywood has told several times before.
Right. Yeah. It almost, when I was thinking about it, Millennium Actors just kind of reminded me of WandaVision a little bit. Just with the homages, but it's coming from a place of love for these old movies, or WandaVisions, these old TV shows. And that comes through, in the work, and so I mean, like you said, it's just a next level of craft. I mean, he didn't have to do that, but it's a next level of craftsmanship for him to put that in there, and just shows that he's a true lover of these various but these storytelling art forms. And these various directors that he's pulling from, and what's really interesting is that there's unfortunately it's defunct now, but there's a YouTube channel called Every Frame a Painting. I don't know if you've heard of it, but they have an episode on this is really kind of focused on editing in terms of movies, but they have an episode on Satoshi Kon they just talk about kind of like where he was coming from and how many other directors were influenced by his movies, and like literally pulling frames, directly from his movies and putting it into their live action movies. So it's interesting to see that cycle where he's kind of influenced by live action that goes into his animation, and then these directors that kind of grew up watching his stuff or was very influenced watching his stuff have now taken his animation and put it back into their movies.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's not often that, I mean, we usually, especially in the United States, we often look at animation as more the product of the studio than we do an individual. But in anime, it's like you definitely get a feel more for the sense of essentially the working of essentially the auteur theory that the French New Wave coined, which is essentially the idea of, while the director is not the only person who creates a film, there is a very significant footprint of that director in the film. And so it's easy to recognize somebody's work, a work like Millennium Actors or Perfect Blue, if you're familiar with his work, and even Tokyo Godfathers is Satoshi Kon, but as well as Spirited Away as Miyazaki. And even in the States with Pixar, we've started to see that with Pete Docter and Brad Bird. I mean, even Brad Bird, when you consider Iron Giant, and even when you consider something like Tomorrowland, which is not necessarily a good film, you still can still see it within the framework of his work, like The Incredibles and Ratatouille as well.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting because, when you look at, like, I have my favorite animes and stuff like that, and I don't know if there's going to be a certain director, animation, or like a story director or animation director, then I kind of, I'll watch it just because I know that they made it or whatever, and so it feels like in Japanese animation, like the auteur, the name matters more than animation in the United States, and we're kind of getting there a little bit because when it comes to live action, a Christopher Nolan movie, right?
Yeah, you
kind of know what you're going to get there, it definitely feels like I'm not sure though if we'll ever get to the point where the person doing the story, the director of the animation in terms of anime is as well known as like the director for a Pixar movie, right? You just you know it's Pixar more so than you know anything else, right? About the person directing it. So I'm not sure if we'll ever if we'll ever get to Christopher Nolan levels, of a person coming into it as in Pixar as we do with even I mean it feels. But in Japan, it's like no, you can enjoy an anime and never know. I mean, there's definitely people that are hardcore into like what animation studios behind it, but never know the animation studio behind it, right?
Right.
Whereas in the West, I mean, Pixar, right? Or DreamWorks, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting, kind of how those compare and contrast and. I do wonder if we'll get to. I mean, Brad Bird, but I do wonder if we'll get to. I mean, maybe not. I do wonder if we'll get to the point where the director sticks out as much for Western animation as it does for our live action or as it does for Japanese animation.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, I think really the only anime filmmaker most Americans, if pressed, could probably name is Miyazaki. I think that it's probably like the only one that people could really I mean I think that's probably the only one that most people could really identify as, oh hey, I recognize his name, and it's because. And ironically, it's because of the fact that, like, for a decade or so, like, Disney was responsible for bringing his movies to the States. And I mean, it's one of those things. And, Spirited Away is one of the few non-American produced films to ever win the Best Animated Feature Oscar. And and the thing is, and I think, if there was less of a disparity in availability with anime, I mean, I think we could get to that point to a certain extent, but at the same time, because of the fact that studios like DreamWorks and Disney and Pixar, they own so much of the territory in terms of availability and access in America. I mean, I think it's kind of harder to do.
His name escaped me. I don't know how it did, but another name on the American side, even though he's had to disappear, John Lasseter.
Yeah.
I think that's probably a name that people who like love Pixar would probably say his name as well, just because because Toy Story is Toy Story.
Yeah.
But yeah, but it's interesting too, because on the TV side of animation, like a Bruce Timm from Batman the Animated Series, or I can never say the last names, so I'm just say Brian and Mike from Avatar: The Last Airbender. You do seem to know. And maybe it just comes down to the audience in terms of like, or perhaps it's the vehicle, because Pixar is the name, and so you say Pixar. It didn't used to be Pixar and Disney, but it's Pixar and Disney. That's all you need to know, right? But if something, but if you have Batman the Animated Series coming on television, it's just you don't even necessarily think about Warner Brothers. You just think about Batman the Animated Series. Okay, now I just kind of want to learn more about it. Who's behind it? That's where you get Chris Tim and what's his name, the guy that did Lost as well, Paul Denny. So it's interesting how that compares also on the TV side, and so it'll be interesting to see how that affects streaming. Or how streaming affects that as well, because there's one of the guys that did Avatar: The Last Airbender went to do the Dragon Prince on Netflix streaming, Aaron Ehaus, and everybody knew he was kind of behind it when it was coming out, so it's interesting how that might change. I think it might be just because of streaming and stuff like that. I think the world just might be moving to sort of episodic animation being the thing, right? The new thing. Animated movies outside of, say, a Pixar might kind of not necessarily die out, but might kind of just take a back burner, to the more episodic style of animation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's where having it's a coup for somebody like HBO Max to have, like, when they debuted that streaming service, the fact that they had exclusive rights to Studio Ghibli, and the fact that they could offer those as a part of. I mean, it's one of the reasons HBO Max is one of the best libraries of films in streaming, because of the fact that in addition to these movies under Turner Classic Movies, in addition to their DC work, in addition to all these other classic films that they also have Studio Ghibli that they can offer. And, so more people who may not be familiar with Spirited Away or My Neighbor Totoro or even Princess Mononoke, like, they can get in that way if they have HBO Now. And it's gonna be interesting to see what because Paramount Plus just launched yesterday, and it's gonna be interesting. I know when you consider Nickelodeon, when you consider MTV, they've got quite a bit of animation that they can offer too. But it's gonna be interesting to see where they take their animation in the future. So whether they can create something whether they can do something along the lines of what we have on HBO Max.
Right. Yeah. It's and that's just good. Just taking it back to Satoshi Kon. It's such a shame that he passed, because you could see, particularly with anime becoming popular and stuff like that, you could see a Netflix just writing him a check for $200 million and saying, give us 2 TV shows and a movie, and who knows what kind of, because I was just reading something about this the other day about Japanese animators and how they're not being paid a whole lot of money. And then you have, which has been the story for years, right? This is nothing new. But then you have Netflix, who has a content budget which is the size of the defense budget of Canada. That's the defense budget of Canada, but it's not the defense budget of the United States.
Right.
But still, we're not. This is not chump change, right?
No.
And they can essentially produce a new movie show or a new TV show every week. Right. Yeah. Netflix, that is a ton of money that they're putting into content. And so, to have, and so it's so unfortunate that he's gone, because to have him in this world where, anime's up, manga's up, and, him being him, I really, think that Netflix or maybe Amazon, who's desperate for content, would have picked him up and asked him to do something, and it could have been like a 2 or 3 movie deal, where he could have just kind of relaxed with as much money as he needed and as much time as he needed to make something, really awesome.
Yeah. Before we get to the work that he did complete, I did want to bring up, within regards to this conversation, the one film that he didn't complete before he passed.
Oh yeah.
Which was Dreaming Machine.
Yes.
And he did start it, and I guess looking at Wikipedia right here, and I guess there were only 600 of the 1,500 shots that had been animated to date, and it's a little. On the one hand, reading some of this, and like part of the reason that they've sort of held off of it is because of the fact that they're also have been looking for a filmmaker that could match Satoshi Kon in terms of abilities and vision, which is part of the reason why they haven't, why Madhouse hasn't completed it yet.
Yeah, good luck with that.
But at the same time, it's kind of surprising that you don't have a Netflix or Amazon or studio like that, or even HBO Max, if I mean, who's who's willing to say, hey, I mean, we'll give you the funds to finish it, if you just want to find the filmmaker to do it. And I mean, it's I mean, I would like to think that maybe at some point we'll actually see that project finish up and come to fruition, but it is a little surprise because of the fact that, I mean, we have gotten movies, recently, in terms of like Netflix basically they brought a recently quote unquote finished Orson Welles project that had been abandoned to streaming. And it's like, I mean, granted, this isn't the same thing, but at the same time, it's like, it is kind of surprising that there isn't a studio that's gone to Madhouse and say, hey, we'll give you whatever money you need to finish it, if you just want to find the filmmaker to finish it.
Yeah. I think that's coming. I think when you look at the trends, when you look at something like the BBC, who is running out of money, and they're essentially saying, like, the only way that they can kind of move forward is to partner with an Amazon or a Netflix, with in create some of their content. They're already doing that, I think, with HBO, with Historic Materials. Isn't that HBO and BBC together?
I believe so. Yeah.
Which I need to see, because I love that book series. And so when you take Netflix, somebody like Netflix, who's willing to give money to, for a sequel to The Dark Crystal, right? Mm-hmm. And when they thought about doing an animated, they were like, no. Netflix was like, no, let's do it with the puppets, right? Yeah. And we'll just write the check, right? And then when you have Netflix moving into anime, and Netflix, just really investing money there. I honestly think it's a matter of time before you have Netflix, potentially Amazon, financing these Japanese productions, and potentially, on a large scale, right? And then potentially leading you to where, it's like, finish, Satoshi Kon's movie, because I bet you they'll find somebody, or a combination of somebody, if Amazon writes a $200 million check.
Oh, right. Yeah.
So yeah. So I hear you. It's definitely surprising that it hasn't come yet, but I think it's coming.
Yeah. So let's bring it back fully to Satoshi Kon, and with his third film, which is Tokyo Godfathers. This is an adaptation of a loose adaptation of a novel, Three Godfathers, that was written in the early 1900s. There have been several adaptations and versions of this over the years. One of the more famous ones is Three Godfathers, which is directed by John Ford. You could also even say, the Three Godfathers essentially was remade and riffed on in 3 Men and a Baby, if you want to go really commercial. But Three Godfathers is basically about Tokyo Godfathers is essentially about three homeless people who find a baby on the streets and take care of it. And they are trying to, and they are also trying to find its, to a certain extent, they're also trying to find its parent, but at the same time, they're also just trying to take care of it in general. And this is, and it's like, this movie is a movie that I didn't necessarily need to sort of warm up to how I felt about Millennium Actress and Perfect Blue, but this is one that I did kind of have to warm up to, partially and probably because of the fact that it was such a left turn for Satoshi Kon as a filmmaker coming off of those two, but really, when you think about it, um, this is one that I just really enjoy watching because it's like it should be a really depressing watch. It's a movie it should be really depressing and dreary, but because of the joy and the way that we're completely engaged with the three main characters in the movie, it's hard not to just absolutely fall in love with this movie.
Right. Yeah. When I was watching the documentary, he said that he kind of was coming from an angle of making it a comedy, and having all these sort of coincidences and sort of happy accidents, if you will, happen throughout the movie. But it's also his traditional kind of dark, it has this very, very dark elements to it. So it's not. I mean, it's definitely not like your traditional sort of American comedy for sure.
Mm-hmm.
But it's definitely comedic for him,
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, this one was the one for me. This one was the one that I found most appealing right off the bat. It was I was immediately taken and in love with this movie when the first time I saw it, and I don't think I don't think I had known at that time just how much of a departure it was for him, somewhat from his previous stuff. So maybe that factored into it, but yeah, I was definitely in love with this movie the first time I saw it.
Yeah, and it's funny because of the fact that you look at Perfect Blue, you look at Millennium Actress, they both are set relatively in reality, but they also break that reality for emotional purposes, whether it's the psychological torment in Perfect Blue or the emotional connection to the past in Millennium Actress. This is the only one that really settles into that specific, definite reality and very much feels like the real world. And I think that's one of the great strengths of this film, as well as just the interaction between the connection between the three characters as well.
Right. And yet at the same time, the story definitely hits on different personas, different lives. Each one of them has sort of a different life that they had to, abandon and whatnot. And so I'm sure that was part of the appeal. But just in terms of him, and the flashbacks, they feel like more than flashbacks.
Mm-hmm.
When you go into, you actually feel like you're somehow he's doing. You actually feel like you're going into these people's lives almost as if you're in a Millennium Actress. Where it's a flashback plus, right. And so it's more. Although it definitely feels like a more sort of rooted in reality, traditional kind of sort of storytelling. Something about his flashbacks feel like they're more than flashbacks. It's perhaps just how he joins it all together. It almost, even though he's going back in time, it almost feels like it's all linear. Like he's giving you the background of these characters at exactly the right moments that you need to know it, and so I feel even though this is definitely a departure, I definitely feel like there are elements of his blending of lives that come through as usual, in his storytelling.
Yeah, and I think it helps that these characters are essentially a family right off the bat. Like it's not one of those things where they have to grow to become a family. They're already a family and they already have the specific dynamics. Like Jin is, he's the obvious father figure. Hannah, who's a drag queen, is very protective of the child. And then you have the teenager, Miyuki, who is essentially a big sister for the baby. and also somebody who's very. Each one of them are dependent on the others, and the fact that they also there's obvious tension between all three of them, but at the same time, they also always will come back as a family, and that's one of the things that is, and that's one of the things that makes this movie just work so beautifully.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. That's what makes it feel a bit warmer, I think, than some of the other the Perfect Blue, where it almost felt like the character was becoming more and more isolated. And then Millennium Actress, the character started off as essentially isolated, but there's this family aspect and implicit love between all the characters. And Tokyo Godfathers that makes it feel warmer, and it makes it gives the audience something to kind of attach and hook onto. This family aspect.
Yeah, and we talked about some of the social commentary at work in Perfect Blue, not so much in Millennium Actors, because Millennium Actors really feels more like a memory piece for a film industry that is past, and doesn't really have a whole lot in terms of social commentary beyond that. But Tokyo Godfathers, because of the fact that all of these characters are homeless, and all of these characters are homeless for one reason or another, they all have faults, or at least societal faults, that people hold against them. Seeing the way that they've sort of adapted to their lives as they've lived them, and seeing the way that they're able to sort of make things, the way that they're able to really put aside the struggles that they've had on the streets, and are able to come together for the purpose of keeping this baby alive. It's one of those things where it speaks to the resilience of really people who are kind of forgotten by society.
Right. Yeah. You definitely get the feeling that even with the attack that happens on the guy, I forget what his name is. The kids that attack him because they think he's just it's interesting when it happens in the story too, because you've really connected with him, and you see it happens right after there's an actual kind of homeless guy that dies. And then these kids come to harass one of the main characters, and you really get the feeling like there's a moment for each character where you really get the feeling like they're an outcast from society, and yeah, this is definitely his commentary on that and how these people are treated in a very visceral way, and yeah, it's in this. He did part of that sort of commentary, like you said, and not necessarily so much Millennium Actors, but Perfect Blue as well. And so it's interesting how he's able to weave social commentary into his stories without necessarily hitting you too hard over the head with it, but still make it really hit you in an empathetic way for the character, or with the character.
Yeah, and it's the. Tokyo Godfathers is so. It's not a predictable story, but it's an easily accessible story, and if you get a chance to watch any of the Satoshi Kon films, I think this is definitely one to check out. I mean, and it's probably the one that I would say start out with, and then sort of go backwards and forwards in his among his 5 projects, with Millennium Actors and then Perfect Blue on the older side of it, and then definitely work your way up to the last 2 projects we're about to talk to, because they go as surreal as we've sort of made Perfect Blue and Millennium Actress sound, it's nothing compared to what we see in the last two projects that he was able to complete before his passing.
Yeah. I'm with you on that. Yeah, I sometimes people, the older style animation is still very very well animated, but Perfect Blue, kind of going back, to still starting with Tokyo Godfathers and then going back to that older style animation, and then maybe going forward to Paprika, which is beautiful animation. That could be a little jarring. I think just to some people sometimes it is for me sometimes when I see an anime that a whole lot of people recommend because the story's so good, but it's an older style animation, so it takes a second to shift into it. But definitely don't let that deter you. To anyone in the audience. You will. Perfect Blue is an older style animation, but once you get used to it, beautifully animated. But once you get used to it, the story will take over.
Yeah. With that said, let's try to dive into these last two projects of his.
Yep.
And let's go ahead and go in chronological order because the first of these two came out in 2004. It is a 13-episode TV series called Paranoia Agent. And this was actually the last one I had seen of Satoshi Kon's. I had already seen his 4 features well over the years. By 2006, by the time Paprika came out, I had seen his previous work. Paranoia Agent's the only one that I hadn't seen, and I actually, before they finally brought out onto Blu-ray this past December, I actually watched this on YouTube in dubbed form, and that was definitely it was an unfortunate way to watch this for the first time. I'm looking forward to watching it again. It's kind of hard to know where to begin with this movie because as weird as Paprika is, Paranoia Agent just is, this is very much Satoshi Kon just completely off the leash. Like, this is 13 episodes of him just really sort of indulging his surreal side, and he does build up different story arcs, and we do get individual characters that we get a look at, but this is definitely one of the wilder animated projects I think you'll watch if you get a chance to watch somebody like Satoshi Kon in general.
Yeah. This one, I didn't have enough time to really watch all the episodes, so I kind of just dug into some of my favorite ones. Particularly the one with the Happy Family Planning episode, which looking at Wikipedia's episode 8. The end of that was really messed me up a little bit. But this Paranoia Agent, and you probably have it in your notes to talk about it, but the music,
yes.
the opening sequence with I'm going to pronounce his name wrong. Hirasawa Susumi.
Yeah.
Hirasawa.
Yeah.
When I was watching the documentary, they talked about I think it was that show was being shown late at night. And so they wanted to make, an intro that was could kind of wake people up, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But then the outro, was kind of like going to sleep.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, but to see like that first of all, the intro song is great.
Mm-hmm.
And then to see the characters kind of like, laughing in these sort of crazy predicaments and scary predicaments. that just really had, I think that really had an effect on me, and I think was what also made the music stand out for me. But I've since become very much a Hirasawa fan. The first thing I did after seeing Paprika was get the soundtrack. That's one of my favorite soundtracks of his. But yeah, no, I mean this whole show. I guess it's like a bunch of some of his ideas that he never really turned into bigger projects. Supposedly. But yeah, I mean, so it's almost like if you give, he's taking these unfinished ideas and just kind of running wild with them. Yeah. And that's a TV show. And so yeah, this is definitely him kind of off the wall. Kind of going crazy, but you still you feel a thread in between all of them, and there's definitely episodes that really work as character studies and just kind of going deep story wise.
Yeah, it's funny because of the fact that like I tried to write something on each episode of this, and you're absolutely right about the music, and it's interesting that it makes sense that they would say that as far as like the opening sequence basically, or the opening music being something that's supposed to wake you up, and then the closing music is something that sort of lulls you to sleep. It's like that is something that becomes very obvious just when watching through each episode. And I love both of those songs for exactly those reasons. And yeah, the music in this is wonderful to watch, to really experience. It's, yeah, I mean, so there are two main characters. I would say there's sort of two main characters that stand out in this, which is the creator of the I guess a pink dog that is basically a popular television character, and it's the dog's name is Maromi, and we see toys of him throughout the episode, throughout the series. And then there's an attacker called Lil Slugger, and he basically attacks several of the different characters, and it's basically in a way there's sort of police procedurals with also psychological aspects sort of going through each episode, and it's sort of the realizations of what is the truth of this world. It does make sense that this is essentially a collection of ideas that he didn't quite put together as cohesive story narratives, and but that's not a bad thing, because I think to a certain extent it makes the series more watchable and more interesting, because you kind of want to see as each episode is going where the next one is going to go.
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't want to make a bunch of TV series like this, yeah. but yeah, it's definitely. I definitely was glad that it was made this way. I mean, you're getting all sorts of elements of Satoshi Kon, throughout these. There's some public-private lives. There's some blending of reality. There's dealing with death. All this typical stuff is kind of thrown in here and kind of mixed around in a big blender and extracted in different ways and stuff like that. So it's definitely. I'm definitely glad that he did it, particularly before he died. We were able to get kind of this full range of his potential ideas and where he could potentially take things. There's, even though he explores, I think in one of the stories or a couple of the stories, public versus private lives, so different lives. He doesn't like I don't feel like at least the main character did that. The main character was really about escaping, mentally escaping the what she had done, with the with the dog on the leash. But and so I felt like that from a main thread of the story was a little bit of a departure. Even though he captured his usual elements throughout the various stories, I thought for the main character and the main thread, it was a little bit of a departure from the storytelling, but it was still a splitting. It was much more of an abstract split, maybe. So not necessarily public and private, but I'm going to make up this whole concept as to what happened and sort of split mentally in order to deal with the mental reality of something. So there was still this sort of split concept in there, but it was definitely much more abstract and not sort of the dual lives that he normally goes with.
Yeah, and it's funny you brought up WandaVision earlier when we were talking about Millennium actors, and it. Mm-hmm. Thinking back on it, it's like I'm looking back at the review that I wrote last year on Paranoia Agent. It's like, it's one of those things where it's like, I'm not going to get into spoilers on WandaVision, but it's like, it does sort of feel, one of the words they have here is that, one of the things I say here is that, Satoshi Kon has about 5.5 hours because, throughout these 13 episodes to explore these concepts in this world rather than just the 90 minutes that he's used to in his feature films. And it's great because of the fact that you can flesh out the world in a way that you can't do within the confines of a feature film. But at the same time, you can't help but feel like maybe if they had reined in the concept a little bit more, it probably would have been a tighter film and like a tighter project. And some of the episodes, like I mentioned specifically in episodes 7 through 10, like this series really lost me. Like I had no idea what it was trying to do in those 4 episodes. Like I have no idea what's going on. And it's like that it's fun to watch to a certain extent, but at the same time, it's also kind of frustrating too.
Yeah. Like that episode that I really like is episode 8. But it almost felt like it could be its own short film. Yeah. Very, very tangentially related to Little Slugger and all that. So there's definitely times when he goes where there's almost like there's a main thread through all the episodes, but there's definitely times where it felt like he almost wrote this story and then he connected it to the main thread. It's like the last thing he did, and so and then put it in the show. So I definitely remember the first time I watched it getting lost too. It's like, where are we, in the main theme, the main sort of thread of the show, and should, and I guess it would be interesting to say, maybe that's an artistic choice that he made, but I don't think so. I think he was just trying to go through his ideas.
He was probably obligated for 13 episodes, so it's like, well, I've got to give him 13 episodes, so here we go. And and I did mention that like by episode 11, we do start to see those previous 4 episodes start to be put into a context in terms of this larger narrative. Like you said, bringing it back to the larger narrative to sort of wrap things up, and it's great that it really shows to the talent of Satoshi Kon that he was able to rein things in and bring things back full circle to the narrative, even if he goes off of the rails, because of the fact that there are some filmmakers who just are not capable of that. Like some of them, once they're gone, they're just gone. You're not going to see them.
Right. They go off the rails and they just keep going.
And it's funny. It's like, one of the filmmakers I would kind of consider, one of the filmmakers I would sort of compare Satoshi Kon to is David Lynch, and I do definitely think that there are films of Lynch's, and I mean even something like Twin Peaks, where it's like they in the second season they solve the fundamental mystery of the series so quickly that the last half of that season just kind of feels lost. And I haven't watched The Return yet. I do need to at some point, but but at the same time, I still kind of enjoyed those episodes because of the fact that it's like I love the fact that he basically just kind of went off on his own. It's like, well, I'm done with the fundamental mystery. I'm just gonna explore this world a little bit more. And
Right.
I also think about his last feature film, Inland Empire, where it's like even though there's a lot of surreal aspects of it that sort of go in various directions, doesn't really have a straightforward narrative. I also feel like to a certain extent the end goes a bridge too far to where it's like if you go too far off of it, it's like, yeah, you kind of lose me a little bit. But
Right.
at his best, sort of like with Satoshi Kon, David Lynch at his best can, if he goes too far gone, he can also bring it back and make it accessible as well. And I mean that's one of the things that is yeah, I mean, and that's one of the reasons. And Stanley Kubrick's another filmmaker that would sort of liken Satoshi Kon to, but that's more from the perfectionist nature of his filmmaking and more than the storytelling as well.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. When I was watching that Every Frame of Painting episode, Wes Anderson was one of the people that they compared him to, just Satoshi Kon to, just with Wes Anderson's ability to sort of sometimes remove visual information in order to communicate something faster. But you can also see with Wes Anderson where he's got this very unique story that he's telling in a unique way, and it could easily go off the rails in a couple of different places. And sometimes he makes these connections that are that where you kind of miss almost like an ellipsis, where he like skips past a certain thing, and you just kind of assume that it happened. But he makes it happen so well in the story that you just kind of keep going. Wes Anderson is probably another one that I would put in there.
Yeah. But I mean, and I think that's certainly a fair comparison. I mean, I can think of moments from Paranoia Agent, especially from Tokyo Godfathers, that I can definitely see as being akin to Wes Anderson and the way he would tell those stories, that type of story. But it's one of those things where it's like, I guess because of the surreal nature of things and the more perfectionist nature of Satoshi Kon, the way he presents the story makes me think of Lynch and Kubrick more so.
Right. Yeah, you can definitely see, the hoodlum Kon versus mature Kon coming out in different areas. But at the end of the day, in terms of the framework of the story, the mature Kon won out. And we got something that felt like it completed fairly well, even though you may have gotten lost. Not you specifically, just the audience may have gotten lost here and there along the way. It was a good getting lost. There's some interesting things that happened, or the interesting stories that were told. But it feels like he was mature enough of a artist to kind of link things back together, and tell a story that felt complete.
Yeah. And that brings us to his final film as a director from 2006, Paprika. And it's funny because of the fact that I think when I was watching these last year in preparation for this, it's like one of the things I messaged you about was it's like, yeah, I'm still not entirely sure that I get this film. And this is definitely the film where it's like, I was still very baffled by it for a long time. And it's funny because one of the things that I say in my notes here is that even you can kind of see the visual imagination and the narrative sort of established right away. And I don't think that's something that I don't think the narrative aspect is something that I noticed in my earlier viewings, because the visual imagination in the film is just so pronounced, and it's so it very much it's continuing in the tradition of what Paranoia Agent does in that respect, in terms of the visual imagination and the bending of reality versus memory, and just the messiness of that in general is it's really upfront in this movie in a way that you don't really, even in something like Perfect Blue, I don't think you completely get it.
Right. Yeah. When I was watching that documentary, he said that this film was like I'm having difficulty remember. It's almost like he felt that this film was like a milestone for him, and it's almost like the film that he meant to make with Perfect Blue. Like he just felt like all of his ideas that he had where it was kind of wrapped up in this film. Not that he wouldn't have continued to explore different personas in his other films had he stayed alive, but it sounded like this film was definitely a milestone for him. But yeah, I mean, this film is definitely visually dense in particular areas, and yeah, I mean, for me, I immediately love this film. It's kind of a little bit up my alley, just in terms of like the technology aspect of it. But yeah, I mean, I didn't feel this one felt easier for me to understand than Perfect Blue, actually. If not quite as approachable as the Tokyo Godfathers, but it may have just also been the animation style. But was a little bit easier on the eyes because it's just a little bit more modern than a Perfect Blue. But this, as I mentioned before, part of what really got me with this movie was the music. I thought this was the best. I mean, although the score from Millennium Actress is fantastic, it's incredible. I love the blending of the music and the art in this particular film, and so yeah. So this one for me was an immediate love. But just this one more time, the intro to this film I think is just incredible with his cuts and crazy, off the wall madness editing that he's done at the beginning of this film. I think the intro to this film is just a masterpiece.
Yeah, I definitely noticed the energy of it the last time I watched in August, and yeah, I mean this definitely. There are times where I'm still a bit baffled by this movie, but there are also times where it's like I'm much more in tune with this movie than I was before. And I think watching Kon's films in relative quick succession, and the fact that I was watching Paranoia Agent for the first time, I think that really helped me put Paprika more in the context of his work in general, as opposed to just as a separate work. And this is, it's funny because it's like one of the other things I've mentioned is that it also feels a bit more like a more surreal version of Inception. And this is about a device that has access to dreams and the psyche of therapy patients. And but it also has negative effects on the mind, and that's one of the things that we're wrestling with here. Are those negative effects on the mind? And I think it's one of the things that once you get a grasp of that aspect of it, it's really easier to get into this film.
Right, yeah. It's hard to mention this film without mentioning Inception because they're just I done some reading. I can't remember much of it now. When this movie came out, or when Inception came out. Inception came out after this movie, right? Yeah. Of course, it was influenced by it. But yeah, just the level of influence Christopher Nolan pulled, from Paprika. I mean, I know there's one scene that is basically from Paprika. But I forgot like how much he was influenced by it when I was reading about it. But yeah, I think overall, the science fiction aspect of it was balanced well with sort of the mental illness aspect of it, or like it would have been easy to go far into science fiction and how everything worked, right? Yeah. But it was definitely more focused on like the mind bending aspects of it, and healing yourself, through dreams, or what you could become, sort of the dual personas again, kind of what you could become in a dream versus how you saw yourself in real life. And it was that way definitely for the main character, and even for the sort of the main programmer or whatever developer behind the technology. And so I like the fact that very similar to Inception, where it was much more about the characters rather than the technology.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that I think makes Satoshi Kon such an important storyteller. In addition, even more than just an animated filmmaker, just one of the great storytellers in film. I mean, I would put him up there with Kubrick, with David Lynch in that respect, because of the fact that I think he's somebody who had very specific interests in his films, who isn't afraid to challenge audiences when it comes to giving them images that may take a film or two, a viewing or two, to really get a grasp on. And I think that's one of those things. And it's like, it's one thing to be able to say, hey, I saw this film once, I enjoyed it. It's one thing to be able to say that. And it's like, I love films that I can say that with, but at the same time, I also love films that challenge me, that draw me into watching them again to see if I can understand them a little bit more.
Right.
And it's funny because of the fact that sort of going to Lynch just briefly, is like one of the films of his. The first film of his that I'd seen was Lost Highway. If you're familiar with that film, that shouldn't be the first David Lynch film that you watch, because it's very much in keeping with his Mobius strip type of filmmaking that sort of came out after Twin Peaks, and with Fire Walk with Me, and then Mulholland Drive and Inland Empire later. And it's not necessarily something you're going to get on the first time. And it's like, as I've rewatched the film over the years, I have more of an appreciation for it. And I think, repeat viewings of movies is something that if you're able to do it, it's a good thing. I mean, obviously, when I talk about able to do it, obviously time constraints as well. Because even there are times where I have a hard time rewatching movies, where it's like I'm focused so much on movies that are going on right now. It's hard to sometimes rewatch movies unless I'm doing them for a podcast or something like that. And I think filmmakers like Satoshi Kon are filmmakers that reward those repeat viewings, and I definitely feel like Paprika's done that for me.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, his movies are almost made for repeat viewing. Even from the standpoint of you kind of know what's coming, but still the descent or the blending of realities, particularly in a movie like Perfect Blue, even though you know it's coming, it's still kind of you can still kind of go one step deeper with almost each viewing, just and really think about the implications of things. He just gives you a lot to think about. In addition to like, I wouldn't blame anybody for not 100% following Perfect Blue the first time,
Yeah.
or Paprika the first time. So yeah, I mean, his movies are definitely made for repeat viewing, and they offer up something substantial in terms of repeat viewing.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons where it's like and animation filmmakers, we've sort of touched on it. It's like where it's like animation directors don't necessarily get the type of credit that narrative live action filmmakers get, as far as having a particular voice. Even though, I mean, I think a lot of people who would watch animated films, I mean, even Hollywood ones, you can kind of tell that certain filmmakers have a certain voice. And, whether you're talking about Pete Docter, whether you're talking about Matt Groening in terms of TV, whether you're talking about Bruce Timm and the other creators of the DC animated shows, and John Lasseter, Brad Bird, and so on and so forth. It's like different animated filmmakers have they have signatures too. They have things that make you realize that it's like, oh hey, I remember that guy. He did this one, and it's like, this reminds me of this. Oh hey, it's the same filmmaker. And it's like one of the things that I think that's one of the things that's kind of it's kind of a modern thing in American animation, where it's like, with the exception of somebody like Ralph Bakshi, who's very much an independent, not really beholden to a specific animation studio. It's like, you don't really, outside of the the Looney Tunes filmmakers, directors, your Chuck Joneses, Chris Freelings, and Tex Avery's, it's like Disney didn't really promote their early films as, from the same filmmakers as like Fantasia or Snow White and stuff like that. You didn't really know, unless you went looking at who the director's credits, you don't necessarily know who made those films. They essentially were, the credit was Walt Disney as the producer. And I mean, it's like, even in, to a certain extent, even the golden age in the late 80s, early 90s of Disney still kind of worked in that vein. And it wasn't really until Pixar that we started to see a shift in that, I think. And so, we've talked about different filmmakers, animation filmmakers, having particular voices, and it's like, I think you'd be hard pressed to find people who love Hayao Miyazaki's films who wouldn't necessarily say Hayao Miyazaki is one of their favorite filmmakers, and they would put him in the same list in the same vein as a Spielberg or Scorsese or a live action director. And I think Satoshi Kon fits within that perspective too, because of the fact that, I mean, even with something that seems very out of his wheelbox and out of his basic formula that we've covered in this episode, like Tokyo Godfathers, it still feels like a Satoshi Kon film in a lot of ways. And so, I mean, when I say Satoshi Kon is one of my favorite filmmakers, it's like, I don't have a problem putting him up there with people like Kurosawa or Bergman or Truffaut or other filmmakers that I just absolutely love.
Right. Yeah. I'm with you. I mean, although he does animated films, and like you said, like, there's this almost kind of dichotomy between, an animated film director and a live action film director. And I'm not saying like animated film directors look down upon. They're just not put on the same type of pedestals that the feature film directors are. But when I say Satoshi Kon or Miyazaki, I think of him as, the same vein I think of a Christopher Nolan.
Yeah.
He's an animation director, but when I walk away from his films, I feel like I walked away from a live action film in terms of the sensibilities, in terms of the themes, unlike I get when I walk away from maybe a traditional sort of Western animation. Mm-hmm. And so yeah, and I'm hoping. Again, I think the future might just be sort of episodic animation, but I'm hoping for whatever it's worth, and perhaps just so that these people kind of get paid what they're worth. That perhaps these animation directors are seen as more celebrities, or their names are known more, and they're not hidden behind the Disney stamp or the Netflix stamp.
Yeah. And with that said, I think this is a good place to wrap it up. And David, thank you very much for joining me to discuss this great filmmaker who is gone, but certainly not forgotten.
Indeed, gone too soon. But I'm glad that the works that he left I'm glad that he was able to leave the works that he left, because I think that they will continue to influence and inspire long past his passing.
I'd like to thank David Miles for joining me on the podcast to discuss Satoshi Kon, and it's always good to talk to him, and I always enjoy talking to him. He has some really good ideas on film and pop culture, and he's sort of my go-to as far as anime, and hopefully sometime in the future we'll talk about Cowboy Bebop, because I really love that series as well. That's it for this episode of the Sonic Cinema Podcast. Thank you very much for joining us on however you listen, whether it's over Apple, Google, or Spotify, or at the Sonic Cinema Podcast YouTube channel. Also, check us out at patreon.com/Sonic Cinema. Coming up, I'm going to be talking with a returning guest on some classic films, as well as the prelude to the Oscars. They're finally coming, thank God, after a way too long award season. But for now, this is Brian Scuttle, and thank you very much for checking us out at www.sonic-cinema.com.